the best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Now, China is the world's top greenhouse gas polluter, contributing about a third of mankind's total annual carbon emissions. Yet, it is also the world's top producer of clean energy and a major global investor. Since 2023, Chinese clean tech companies have entered into over 180 deals worldwide worth 188 billion Sing dollars. In fact, according to ABC News, global emissions could start to fall this year for the first time since the Industrial Revolution, largely thanks to China's efforts. And earlier this month, China's National Development and Reform Commission announced that the country would be investing in major renewable energy projects, developing new offshore wind farms and large-scale clean energy bases that combine solar and wind farms. It's the latest move by the country, both a leader in renewable energy and the world's biggest emitter of greenhouse gases, to make inroads in the green energy transition. So is China trying to control the global clean tech sector, and can the world's biggest polluter end up saving the world? Well, joining us today to share more is Tim Buckley, who is the Director of Climate Energy Finance. Hi, Tim. Welcome to the show.
Good evening, Hongbin.
Thank you so much for joining us, Tim. Tim, Chinese companies have been aggressively expanding their footprint in the global clean tech sector, from EVs to wind and solar power, particularly in developing nations. How did China transform from a low renewable energy producer to becoming the world's top clean tech powerhouse in just 15 years?
It is an absolutely staggering development in China, and I'm sitting in Australia. It is amazing to watch the transformation, as you said in your introduction. China is the biggest electricity market in the world by far, and it is a major investor in fossil fuels. But as you said, over the last 15 years, the government has done a major long-term strategic planning initiative, which has really seen China lead the world in clean tech technology development, in clean tech manufacturing capacity, in clean tech domestic installations, and also in exports. What we're noting in our recent research is that China is now starting to go global in those world-leading clean tech sectors and is investing equity and debt and infrastructure assets and manufacturing capacity around the world. And probably most importantly, as you flagged, a lot of that is going into the global south. So I think it's brilliant. It's building really strong geopolitical bridges with a whole lot of really critically in need developing countries at a time when America is busy going in exactly the opposite direction.
Right. Well, then can China's leadership in clean tech, from solar to wind energy, help in accelerating the global energy transition?
It will absolutely accelerate the transition. What we are seeing, like we've just put out a new report this week, China has built dramatic amounts of new manufacturing capacity in solar and batteries, for example. The world now has 3 times the manufacturing capacity of solar modules relative to what we installed globally in 2024. In batteries, the same thing. The world now has manufacturing capacity 3 times what we installed and used in all of our EVs and energy storage systems last year. And 80% of that manufacturing investment is coming from China. So China absolutely leads the world in this sector, and the result of major capacity expansions ahead of demand growth is that China is constantly driving the price down of solar modules, of wind turbines, of battery energy storage systems, of electric vehicles, and all of that is helping all consumers who are open to Chinese exports. So obviously I'm excluding the American consumer. Everyone else in the world is benefiting from ongoing massive deflation, lower prices for higher quality products. It's really, I think, staggering to see.
I see. Well, then, given the pace of China's clean tech expansion, as you've highlighted there, do you think that this growth is sustainable, though, in the long term? Are there any risks that could derail this progress?
There are definitely risks, and geopolitics is the number one risk. I see no risk of China being beaten by any other nation when it comes to investment in technology, in terms of their investment in manufacturing capacity. But the geopolitics is the real problem. We've seen America, particularly in the last couple of months, putting tariffs on absolutely everything that China is exporting. But America is also putting tariffs on everyone else. So I see this as a geopolitical response that China has really well thought through the idea. As America goes isolationist, as America goes back to its fossil fuel roots, China is absolutely dominating all of these zero emissions industries of the future. They're investing unprecedented amounts of research and development investments to build the technology. And as our report highlights, they're actually starting to partner with companies and countries around the world to share the manufacturing. So they're pushing a lot of the manufacturing offshore into Brazil, into Vietnam, into Indonesia, into Saudi Arabia, Spain, Turkey, you name it, almost everywhere. And that then gets around the imposition of tariffs as countries across Europe, for example, and India start to respond saying we're overly dependent on Chinese supply chains. Well, you can get around that if you build a massive new factory in Spain for building batteries, exactly what China is doing right now, a 4.1 billion euro investment in partnership with Stellantis in Spain, employing Spanish workers to export batteries across the whole of Europe. You get around the big threat of tariffs on Chinese exports. So I think they are playing this game. As usual, China is playing a long strategic game, and the exporting of that manufacturing know-how, the robotics, the technology is really helping other countries, particularly the global south, leapfrog technologies and embrace the opportunities of energy security by building out domestic renewable energy, domestic batteries, domestic EVs, electric vehicles, so that they can get off their addiction to imported fossil fuels.
Well, speaking of, China's expansion and investments, in the past year, Chinese solar panel makers have been opening or ramping up manufacturing facilities in Indonesia. In particular, the Trina Mas Agra Indonesia solar panel plant is a $100 million joint venture between China's Trina Solar, Indonesian conglomerate Sinamas, and Indonesian state utility PLN. Why is China investing in Indonesia in particular? Are there any strategic reasons behind this?
I think it's very strategic, and it was really important, those alliances that you just mentioned. Some of the largest companies in Indonesia are partnering with the world's leading technology providers in China to build manufacturing capacity in Indonesia to employ Indonesian workers to supply not just the Indonesian market, but also for export. And so they're building alliances, geopolitical alliances that are really robust. Rather than just exporting solar modules built in China, they're building them in Indonesia. But what I see, the pivot in China's strategy is recognizing the power of some of these huge emerging markets like India, Brazil, Indonesia, Vietnam, Mexico. They're massive domestic markets, and we've seen the strong ongoing economic growth in a lot of these emerging markets, particularly in Southeast Asia. And so China's actually starting to focus on the consumer in Indonesia, the consumer in Brazil, the consumer in Vietnam, and saying this isn't just an export or a re-export strategy to get around American tariffs. It's actually about providing electric vehicles, battery storage systems, wind turbines, solar modules for use and deployment in Indonesia. And so that will then help Indonesia encourage them with self-sufficiency and domestic supply. And therefore, every time they build new solar projects, they reduce their need to import oil, for example, from the Middle East. So it actually permanently improves the energy security of Indonesia.
I see. Well, Trina Mas Agra Indonesia has the potential to export green electricity to Singapore as well. Do you think, cross-border energy trade could shape the future of regional cooperation in Southeast Asia's energy sector?
I think that is another positive development. We know that the sun predictably goes down every night. We know that the wind is intermittent. It doesn't always blow. What you need is an internationally connected grid. And that's why Europe's leading the world in deployment of renewable energy, because they have effectively 27 countries that have strong cross-border trade. There has long been discussed the idea of building a interconnected international grid system across Southeast Asia. Laos is really starting to develop that, and China's capital, China State Grid, is actually building massive grid connectivity. So Laos, for example, is starting to export wind and solar and hydropower both to China but also to its ASEAN neighbours. And so Indonesia, as you mentioned, is building a subsea cable 50 kilometres across into Singapore so that Singapore can leverage solar, cheap domestic solar, zero emissions solar from Indonesia. And Singapore obviously has limited land mass. Indonesia's got a huge land mass, and so there's a really good synergy. But Indonesia's also got a lot of hydro, and they've got really strong wind potential. So that's a win-win situation where international trade of zero emissions, low-cost energy builds energy security, it builds strategic alliances. So I see that as a necessity, but also a positive outworking of this energy transformation.
I see. Well, Tim, while many governments have welcomed the investment as a means to accelerate their transition to a low-carbon economy, others remain wary of China's growing dominance. Why are some countries, skeptical of China's role in their green transition? Is this just a matter of economic concerns or political and strategic anxieties?
No, I think there is absolutely justification for some of those fears. It's very largely unprecedented that one country has 60, 70, 80, 90% global dominance of key industries of the future. And by that, I'm talking about all of the solar supply chains of the world. I'm talking about wind turbines. I'm talking about electric vehicles and batteries and grid transmission systems. China is absolutely dominating the world in these industries. And so in my country, Australia is very wary of being 100% reliant on China's ongoing goodwill. And so there is this push around the world to say, well, we want to actually build up diversity of supply chains. COVID taught us that diversity of supply chains is critically important. But that's why I'm really encouraged by China working with Indonesia to build Indonesian manufacturing capacity, to build Australian manufacturing capacity, to build it in Vietnam and Thailand as well. And they're doing that not just in solar, but in batteries, in electric vehicles and so on. So I see this as a way of actually reducing that geopolitical fear of over-reliance on one country. One country, whether it's China or America or Japan, you don't want to be over-reliant. COVID taught us that, and I think that's why this new development by China is really strengthening the international collaboration. But I am reminded, I was looking at BYD, like the number one electric vehicle company in the world. They have 120,000 engineers working in technology development, in batteries and electric vehicle technology development. That's more workers in research and development in one company than almost any other company in the world. It's staggering how much they're investing in the technology. We saw them announce last week the world's fastest charger.
Right.
It's literally 100% faster than any other charger available for electric vehicles. So the technology continues to improve with every year, and China is sharing that by building manufacturing capacity with the latest technology, the latest robotics in these countries like Indonesia, like Australia, like Vietnam, and I see that as reducing the geopolitical fears of over-dependence on Chinese exports.
I see. Well, several key points in contention are the fear that, Chinese investments could undercut local industries, making it harder for domestic clean tech companies to compete, as well as there's been also, labor-related concerns, particularly over their employment practices. Is there any form of evidence to support these concerns?
There is a very telling case, like I've just given BYD an enormous positive rap. The Financial Times has done a couple of exposés of one factory in Brazil that BYD is building, and it's an electric vehicle factory, and the factory's been closed down because of inappropriate labour practices at that factory by some subcontractors to BYD. I'm hoping that is very much a one-off case. I'm hoping that China and BYD in particular realises they're building a consumer brand. You can't use unfair labour practices and think that that's not going to have negative implications for your brand. So at the end of the day, we can throw rocks at other companies and other countries. I think all countries, including my own, have to be very wary of doing that. We need to clean up our own practices first. But at the end of the day, China is being held to account in other markets. So the factory I mentioned in Brazil has actually stopped construction because they've had to send all of the Chinese labourers back to China because they'd held their passports back, according to the press report. So there are always going to be some shonky operators, some shonky subcontractors available. I'm hoping BYD will learn by experience and realise that their brand is worth so much more. They're going to actually have to play as a good global corporate citizen. As China does develop that, it's a learning experience, and I think at the end of the day, it's moving in the right direction, but there are always some bad experiences as we learn.
Well, meanwhile, there's been some tensions between China and Western nations over clean tech that have been escalating as well. In particular, the European Union recently proposed that Chinese companies should be required to transfer intellectual property in exchange for EU subsidies. And in the UK, concerns over the role of Chinese wind giant Mingyang Smart Energy in Scotland's offshore and wind sector. What prompted the sudden tension between China and Western nations, and how significant are these barriers for Chinese companies, Tim?
I think the tensions are very real. They are building, and America has certainly put a spotlight on trade imbalances. And we know China is running a massive trade surplus. And with their dominance of these new clean tech industries of the future, and with the investment that the country has made over the last 10 to 15 years, the export profile has expanded dramatically, and so that has really highlighted key supply chain concentration risk, which is a factor that we all have to worry about post-COVID, and over-dependence on one nation is a problem. And so that's why I see it as really important that China's starting to encourage its clean tech leaders to build manufacturing capacity overseas, so that it's overseas investment, overseas jobs, and it's sharing the technology. So as you flagged, that means they actually have to build the world-class factories in other nations as well. And there is a little bit of tension in China itself about do they restrict some of the best technology only to their own domestic factories? But at the end of the day, consumers, when you're building electric vehicles, they want to see the best technology. If they know they're getting the second-hand technology or the weaker stuff, then they'll buy other brands. So I think at the end of the day, China is starting to build really strong brand profiles. Nothing better than BYD is an example of that. I think consumer pressure and BYD's absolute desire to win means that Western consumers, the global South consumers, will get the best technology at extremely competitive prices.
Well, speaking of which, beyond economic incentives here, there's also a broader political dimension to China's clean energy expansion. I mean, Beijing has aggressively invested in securing supplies of critical minerals such as nickel in Indonesia and lithium in Africa, and is dominating global processing of these resources. Do you think China's green expansion is purely about economic opportunity, or is this a strategic move to strengthen their influence over resource-rich nations?
It is definitely a geopolitical strategy to strengthen China's global position, without doubt. At the end of the day, I say as an Australian, we've watched America dominate the world's economy in terms of investment, technology, setting the rules and regulations that the rest of the world has to abide by. And we are seeing a tectonic shift where we're going from America's absolute supremacy as the number one economy in the world to a multipolar world where America is going to be a great power, but so will China, so will Europe, and I would emphasize so will India. And so it's actually going to be a safer world in a multipolar world. It's not going to be about China dominating the world, but there are fears about that, and that's why I'm really applauding China's move to invest in other countries and to work more collaboratively. I would criticise the first version of the Belt Road Initiative a decade ago was all about mega projects. It was all about massive ports, massive coal plants, massive hydro facilities. There was definitely a military ambition in there. Building massive ports in Pakistan right next to India was definitely military as well as economic and civil interests. And this time around, it's building wind farms, it's building solar projects, it's building electric vehicle factories, and it's building, as you mentioned earlier, in partnership with domestic companies as well. And so I think China has learnt that the death trap that was associated with some of the major projects in the BRI a decade ago come back to haunt them and undermine their geopolitical standing. This time around, I think it's going to be smaller and beautiful is a Chinese phrase. But when we're talking about a $100 million factory, it's not a $20 billion hydro facility. It is more distributed. It is done in partnership, and it is actually done with local workers, whereas a lot of the BRI projects employed 100% Chinese staff.
Right.
There was almost no employment benefit a decade ago when I was looking at projects in Indonesia or in Pakistan or Bangladesh. They were all staffed by Chinese workers, whereas this time around, like the Mexican plants, the Brazilian plants, the Indonesian plants, they're 80 to 90% domestic workers, and the last 10 to 20% are the engineers and the managerial staff who are actually doing the training and doing the technology transfer to train up the local staff.
I see. Well, at the same time, Tim, there have been looming concerns over the environmental costs of China's expansion in green tech, particularly in its mining operations. How serious is this concern, and does that mean China should start pushing back on their mining practices?
I think China, like all mining companies and countries, needs to work to the best world standards. China in Indonesia, I think quite rightly, has got a bad rap. The investments they've made, they've invested $2-4 billion in nickel mining and nickel processing in Indonesia. There are massive negative consequences when you do refining of critical minerals and nickel and copper and so on. I think they need to actually realise that just because it's not their backyard, it's not mining in China, they need to apply world's best practices. They need to be held to account. They need to hold their own companies to account. But, yeah, Indonesia certainly has plenty of bad examples of where they're using coal-fired power plants, for example. They're doing a lot of emissions into the water stream. They're doing a lot of dislocation of domestic communities. They could have done a lot better, and I do think the Chinese government needs to realise that as they go global, as they dominate these industries, if they're not going to see a bigger geopolitical backlash, they have to work with the local communities, with the recipient countries, and make sure it is a win-win for all of them. Otherwise, like in Brazil, BYD's factory, as I mentioned, it's meant to be operational, but it's actually idle. The construction process has stopped because of the worker backlash. So I'm hoping China, like any country, will work to best practice. And I think as China increasingly dominates the world in these industries, they need to hold themselves to a high standard.
I see. Well, despite China's momentum here, though, there lies significant challenges on China's end as well. I mean, domestically, Chinese wind turbine manufacturers have faced plummeting prices, with onshore wind turbines dropping nearly 60% since 2020. Tim, what does this mean for the future of Chinese wind technology then? Would this deter China's goal of its green tech expansion?
I've been investing in China 15 years ago, and it's actually a really hard market for foreigners to invest in. And as you mentioned, the domestic competition is extreme. We have seen China invest massively ahead of demand growth. And so the ultimate outcome is aggressive competition, both in the domestic market and in export markets. And we see battery prices are down 20, 30, 40% in the last 12 months. Solar module prices are down 50 or 60% in the last 18 months. Now, that is applying in China, but it's also applying in the export markets. That is extreme competition in wind turbines, as you said, massive deflationary outcomes, which is great for the commercialisation of wind farms, solar farms, battery projects and EVs, but it is ruthless competition, and it's very different to the Western market concept where I was a finance analyst at Citigroup for 20 years. We, in the financial markets, work on 3-month quarterly earnings trends. China works on multi-decade basis. Their strategies are very long-term, and they seem to be willing to lose money for several years before they really pull the companies back into alignment. And we've seen that in solar module manufacturing. You mentioned in wind turbines as well, but I do emphasise the investment these Chinese companies make in research and development. The average, the biggest turbines in China are now 10, 15 megawatts for onshore and 15, 20, 25 megawatt turbines for offshore. That's 100%, 200%, 300% bigger than we were seeing 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago. So the scaling up of the technology is just mind-blowing. I mean, 10 years ago, the average onshore turbine was 1 megawatt. Today, it's 5 going to 10 megawatts. And that means you get far greater efficiencies and far lower cost of energy generation. And by the way, it's zero emissions energy from wind and solar, which means they're actually helping solve for the climate crisis, which there is no economy on a dead planet.
I see. Well, before we let you go here, Tim, lastly, what else will you be looking out for in China's mission towards green tech? Do you also expect any hurdles that may delay their expansion plans?
I think you've nailed it. I mean, I know I've been very positive about what China is doing. The geopolitical tensions globally are rising. China needs to keep playing the long game. They need to play a game that involves a win-win-win, a win for Chinese companies, a win for the recipient companies in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Saudi Arabia, in Uzbekistan, and they need to actually accelerate this so that we can really help the global south leapfrog technologies and deploy the wind, solar, batteries, electric vehicles. All of that builds energy security, but it also means we can actually drive the world to decarbonise. It's not good enough just for China to decarbonise their economy or for the developed world to decarbonise our economy. But we all need to help the developing nations do that. And we're seeing that in India. India's solar installs last year doubled versus their average for the last 5 years. So India's looking to build 50 gigawatts of wind and solar every year for the next 5, 10 years under Prime Minister Modi, but they're doing it in partnership with Chinese technology providers. And so that's a live example. Pakistan deployed 15 gigawatts of solar modules just in the last 12 months. That's building massive energy security and low-priced energy, domestic solutions for the average person in Pakistan. So I think there are a lot of merits here. China needs to actually stay altruistic and work collectively towards a livable planet and to hold themselves to a higher count. Otherwise, they will suffer a geopolitical backlash.
I see. Well, thank you so much, Tim, for your time and your insights today.
Hongbin, thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. That was Tim Buckley, Director of Climate Energy Finance. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.